Karen told me not to respond. She's just a Validic kind of person. Okay. All right, Chevra. So we saw all of the, did we see all the Imrei Yaakov yet? No. So we have to just finish the Imrei Yaakov on Sif Aleph. And we had learned yesterday that the poor of your own city take priority. Well, first of all, your relatives take priority on loans, and then the poor of your own city, and then the poor of another city. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Yeah, I mean, usually in Hilchos Tzedakah, Eretz Yisrael counts as Aniyei Ircha. I assume it's going to be the same with loans. So, but let's see. Lahaktim Aniyecha Hakrovim. You have a mitzvah to place your poor relatives first. Aviv v'im. And by the way, yesterday we saw that sometimes this hierarchy will take a backseat to what the loan is for. Let's say if a person needs a loan for food, and your relative needs a loan for something that's not as essential as food, let's say for clothing, so then the person who needs the loan for food would take priority. Okay, so you have to place your poor relatives first. Aviv v'imo kodmim levanov, that your father and mother take priority over your children. So if mom and dad need a loan, and your kids need a loan, like I think some of us in the sandwich generation can relate to this, but thank God, most of us, our parents are okay. But unfortunately, there are situations where a person may have a parent who is on a fixed income, and then just watch The Wire. So a parent is on a fixed income and something could happen, something catastrophic occurs, and they need money. So a parent takes priority over a child. Child needs help with the down payment on the house, and your parent needs help putting them into the old age home. And you have a question which one you should loan the money to. Parent takes priority over a child. Okay, that's very important. Absolutely. Because you don't have a mitzvah of kibbud banim. You have a mitzvah only of kibbud avayim. Okay. V'halvoas banav kodmim le'echav. Lending your children money takes priority over lending your siblings money. The echav me'aviv kodmim, or so the achiv me'aviv kodmim, or the echav me'aviv kodmim le'echav me'imo. Your siblings from your paternal side, let's say your half siblings, they take priority to your half siblings from your mother's side. Shnehem kodmim l'shar krovim, and siblings take priority over other relatives like cousins or uncles or nieces or nephews. Ushar krovim kodmim afilu l'talmid chacham, and other relatives take priority even over a talmid chacham who's a non-relative. Okay, next. And this is who's he quoting from? This is from the Ramah and the Chafetz Chaim Abbas Chesed. Okay, va'aniye ircha la'aniye ira cheres, that the poor of your own city take priority over the poor of another city. V'heim koidmim afilu li'ir acheres shel Eretz Yisrael, and the poor of your city take priority over the poor in another city in Eretz Yisrael. The Yoshve Yerushalayim kodmim al shar ayaros Eretz Yisrael, and those who dwell in Yerushalayim take priority over all other cities in Eretz Yisrael. It sounds like from what he's saying that if you have a choice between the poor of your own city and the poor of Yerushalayim, the poor of your own city take priority, right? And that's what he says in the first part. The poor of your own city take priority over the poor of a city in Eretz Yisrael. And the highest, but certainly the poor of Eretz Yisrael take priority over someone who's outside your city. And so, like, say, for example, sometimes you'll have Mishulachim that come from Montreal, right? You can apply the same principle to Hilchos Tzedakah. A Mishulach who comes from Montreal or comes from Belgium would not take a priority over someone who comes from Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, if you have limited funds to allocate, should allocate more. Number one, Aniyei Ircha, the poor of your own city, take highest priority. Then Aniyei Eretz Yisrael. And within Aniyei Eretz Yisrael, Aniyei Yerushalayim. And then the Aniyim of the rest of the world. Okay. Then Gedola Min Hatzdaka. And in certain respects, the mitzvah to lend a person money is an even higher mitzvah than giving them tzedakah. Okay, and he explains, Kida Amru Chazal Gedola Halmalva Yoser Min Hanose. Great, the sages, this is quite literally a statement from the sages, and this is in Shabbos Daf Samach Gimel Amid Aleph, that greater is the lender than the giver. Shemisha niskala dochko bein b'nei adam begila atzma levakesh mehem. He says, because once a person reveals that he's under financial pressure, ein dochko v'tzaro k'misha dain lo bala osa busha v'yarei mihikanespa. He says his financial pressure is not comparable like someone who has not yet come to that level of embarrassment where he needs to ask people for a handout. And if you give a person a loan, he may never need to put out his hand to beg, to ask for a handout. So therefore, in other words, you're doing a tremendous chesed with a person. You're allowing them to preserve their dignity of not having to be looked at as a schnorr, as a person who needs other people to give them money. Al kain hi ziranu torasenu hakdosha al zeh lisod hamach b'halva ter mitzarech lavo liyishol ulevakesh nadava. Quoting the Rambam, the Torah commands us to help someone who's in a precarious financial situation by lending them money before they come to the more desperate state of having to ask for a handout. Okay, so in other words, you're saving someone from descending further down the chain of despair. Yes. Yeah, our shul's involved also. We have an account with them.
Right, so I'm signing on it, but once I sign on, it's like there's nothing involved in it. I'm just sort of guaranteeing it. That would be the same way.
You mean as a co-signer?
Yeah. Like that. So in other words, they lend the money to the individual, and then I'm guaranteeing it.
Yeah, you're acting as you're a guarantor. You're a guarantor. Yeah. Well, it's not the same as lending them your own money, but you're definitely doing a mitzvah. It's definitely a mitzvah because you're enabling them to get a loan. And if they default, you're on the hook for it. If they default, that's the reason why you're acting as a guarantor, right? So you're definitely doing a chesed. Is it? Yeah, it's coming under the mitzvah of halva, of lending someone money, but it's not, obviously. Well, you're participating in that loan so that you're enabled. I'm sure we'll get to that as well. Our shul, there's someone who runs a private gemach, that's Mendel Rubinoff in our shul. But in addition to that, we were approached to start our own account with the Toronto Free Loan Society. And so our shul, we committed to, but on behalf of my generous congregants, I committed to $18,000 as a seed over 3 years. And I take it slowly out of our charity fund that people donate to periodically. So we're almost paid off. And that money stays in perpetuity. It's it stays like in a fund. And the whole shul gets the zechus of being participants in loans to individuals in the Jewish community. Yeah, on some level. I mean, if anyone who contributed to that fund, well, first of all, you have to realize you haven't loaned that money. You've actually given that money away. You've actually fulfilled the mitzvah of tzedakah, but that mitzvah of tzedakah went to something which is the highest level of chesed, which is to loan people money. Now, so you should feel gratified. Okay, my tzedakah went to setting up a fund where we can loan people money.
He managed to as well. It sounds like it's an annuity.
Exactly. And by the way, I know people from our own shul who have taken advantage of the fund already. Just so you should know. So it's. I think to me it's very gratifying. The cost of hataz, the hadigdola mitzvah halvamin hatzdaka. He says the Taz explains somewhat differently. He says the reason why lending is greater than charity. Perishim yesh lefanav beis mitzvahs ha'echad laseis la'ani matana beis lahalvos la'ani. He says that if you have two opportunities and you have limited amount of cash, one you can use that cash to lend someone money, and the other one is to give it away to tzedakah. Yasok tchila b'halva la'ani. You should use it first to help with a loan. The oso shenitzrach lekabel matana kivar hurgal bekach umishtadalo bekaluz. Listen to this phenomenal insight. Someone who is used to receiving tzedakah treats the gift lightly. In other words, he treats the handout with a more casual attitude because he's already become accustomed to being on the take. Okay, he says, but a person who borrows money will appreciate what is being given to him that much more because he's not used to being on the dole, and therefore he has a greater appreciation and has a greater uplift from what you've given to him on a loan than the person does when they're receiving charity. There are people who spend their whole lives being on the dole, right? And they don't. There were times when we had a lot of kids and we had to rely on tuition subsidies, and you don't treat it as seriously, even though it's charity. You don't treat it as seriously as you would, let's say, if someone were to lend you money. And that's what a lot of schools are doing now. A lot of schools are basically saying, we'll give you a tuition subsidy as a loan. You got to pay it back. So, whether or not, that's an interesting discussion, but definitely psychologically, there's something here. And he's, yeah.
Almost like it's over. You have no more relationship. The loan is ongoing, so you still have that obligation. So then you have that sense of, I don't know, the responsibility.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you, Paul. Right. It's a good point. And then he finishes off and he says, Roy l'chol tzibor lasos kupas gemach. Every congregation should set up a gemach. A gemach meaning a free loan society. It's exactly what it means. Okay. Uva'avas chesed herich bazeh ayin sham. And the Chafetz Chaim in his work Ahavat Chesed was very, very lengthy in his discussion of this very idea. So what I'd like to do, maybe Mirz Hashem, tomorrow, I'll bring in a copy of the Ahavas Chesed, and we'll look at chapter 2, section 2, chapter 15, and we'll take a look at the idea of setting up a gemach. The reason why I got involved in this is there's a fellow named Aaron Abacassis. He's from Toronto. He lives in LA. So I got to know him when I was living in Los Angeles, and casually stayed in touch. He does business with one of my sons. And so, and he's on this kick. He's on this, like, this is his passion, is helping set up gemachs with shuls throughout North America. He says most major cities have a free loan society. Most shuls have not plugged into these free loan societies to set up accounts with them. And by the way, I have to acknowledge that part of the reason that most shuls don't plug in is because there's a certain prejudice that many Orthodox shuls have of why should we be lending out money to Jews who aren't religious? I'm embarrassed to say it, but that's the reality. Is that no, we take care of Unzura. We take care of our own, right? Why should we take care of a Jew who's not Shomer Shabbos, right? Yeah, I mean, that's another story. I'm not going to get into that now. I don't want to name names, but
further to what we talked about before about helping the non-Jewish or giving that for peace, for shalom, but maybe even beyond non-Jewish causes.
Yeah,
this is like even one step further.
This is one step further than that, Paul. These are our fellow Jews. They have a din like we learned in the Chazon Ish a long time ago. They have a din of Tinok Shenishba. They're not idolaters. They're not heretics. They're our brothers and sisters. And for us to turn the blind eye because they're not Shomer Shabbos, to me, I guess at this point in my life, I can say it's abhorrent to me to take that attitude. But maybe there was a time in my life when I didn't have that attitude. And so a lot of Orthodox shuls have a very, I would say, closed-minded attitude to this idea of being part of a free loan society that helps out all Jews, regardless of their religious level of observance. Okay. Yeah. Yep. Okay. So anyway, I'm very proud of the fact that we set this up, and Baruch Hashem, people are taking advantage of it. Okay, so that concludes our discussion of our going through the Imrei Yaakov. Let's go back and cover some of the Likutim, and then we'll go to some of the Biurim on the halacha, this very lengthy halacha that we started with. Sure.
Mutual benefit society. Is that the same sort of thing?
I don't know what that is. What's a mutual benefit society?
But I think, yes, but I think it's much more close to the community to which they relate. Like, I mean, does a shul ever do that? Does a shul ever lend out money instead of giving? So, but only to people that they sort of are within their congregation. Because that's
what the charity fund? Yeah. Charity fund goes to various charities. We focus on local causes. It's our primary focus, but a small percentage of it, well, we give it mostly to members. Like, in other words, we make 3 major distributions from our charity fund every year. Before Rosh Hashanah, before Purim, and before Pesach. And those distributions go almost exclusive. I would say 90% of those distributions go to members of the shul who are needy. Now, thank God, I have to say that Baruch Hashem, we live in a time when that number is becoming smaller and smaller of members of our shul who actually need charity in order to get by.
It's not going the other way because of the economy.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. There's a possibility that it could go the other way, but we're living in a different world from where we were even 10 years ago. I get that impression that we're in a much better place, and people in our society are in a much better place, despite all of the downturn and the recession. Let's hope that things stay.
I guess my question was not tzedakah, but lending.
Yeah, we don't lend money from our charity fund simply because it's too difficult to keep inventory of. But I suppose that if there were to come a time when someone needed it, we could tell them, I could theoretically use the charity fund for that purpose, but that's why we have the free loan. And that's why we worked on the free loan society. Okay. Mitzvahs aseh. So let's go to the Likutim now. We had learned that it's a mitzvah d'oraisa to lend a fellow Jew money. V'chol Yisrael chayavim b'mitzvah zu. Every Jew is obligated in this mitzvah, bein isha, whether it's a man or a woman. When does a woman have an obligation to lend out money? When she's unmarried. But if she's married, she doesn't have a right to independently choose what to do with their joint bank account. Okay, unless it's a small amount where she knows her husband will not be makbid, doesn't mind. So when a guy comes to the door, a meshulach, and says, can I have some tzedakah, and she gives him $5, $10, generally speaking, the husband doesn't mind, right? But if she now wants to make a loan she has to consult with her husband first. Halachically, she's obligated. Okay? V'davka mos, aval kli, klei bayis, sheral gilam hashchenim lahashel yishlo yehu, mutaris lahashel shelo mida'ato. He says, but that's only cash. But household utensils that neighbors generally borrow from each other, she doesn't have to ask permission from her husband, unless, it's his, special, maybe he's got a special snow blower, right? That he doesn't want anyone else to use because it's his special. He bought it for $1,000 and it's very delicate and you got to oil it first. You don't know what you're doing with it. I got to show you, right? All these other things. But, like measuring cups and blender or whatever it is. So then if it's normally under her purview, then it's totally okay. Just like you don't make a bracha before you give tzedakah, you also don't make a bracha before you lend someone money. So even though it's a mitzvah sasei deoraisa, you don't make a bracha on it. Like, okay, here's a check for $1,000. Right? You don't do that. Okay, why is that? Because you only make a bracha on a mitzvah that you can fulfill independently of another person. But if you're reliant on another person in order to fulfill the mitzvah, since there's no guarantee they're going to accept, you can't make a bracha. Because maybe the borrower will not want to borrow. Inami, kevin shuhu klala uperanios. Since another answer as to why you don't make a bracha is because since it involves someone else's disadvantage, one person is down and out. You don't want to make a bracha on saying, oh, Baruch Hashem, I can lend you the money. Because you're poor and you're needy, right? The bebracha nemar va'atalo salva, right? Because when there's a bracha involved, in other words, there's a portion of the Torah that are called the brachos. V'hilvisa goyim rabim ve'atalo silva. You will lend many nations money and you won't need to borrow money. So the fact that a guy is standing in front of you needing to borrow money, that's not a bracha. That's the opposite of a bracha. The efes lo yeh b'cha evyon, and the Torah says, in a time of great blessing, there will be no poor among you. And therefore, for whatever reason, God decided that this person should be needy. That's not a reason to make a bracha. I once saw in the name of the Chidushei Harim that there's another reason why you don't make a bracha on tzedakah, and the same would apply to loans. If I was to make a bracha, then I would view you as a tashmish shel mitzvah. I'm viewing you as a vehicle through which I can do a mitzvah. That dehumanizes you. That objectifies you as someone who will help me do a mitzvah. And the Ribono Shel Olam doesn't want us to look at people that way. Right? And that's a beautiful thought, right? So what you don't make a bracha on something like this. Is a human interchange. Don't religify it, if that's a word, by making a bracha on something that's a purely human exchange. Okay. Lahalvos la'aniya Yisrael. There's a mitzvah to lend money to the poor of Israel. Lav davka lahalvos elahu adinim ha'ani balishol mimenu eza kli o chayfetz hanachutz lo. It doesn't just apply to cash loans. Let's say you own something that another person could benefit from. You have a truck, and most people in our community don't have trucks. You have a snowblower, and your neighbor doesn't have it. If you have something that someone else can benefit from, yesh alav chiyuv mitzad hadin lahashilo, pen ein lo ata b'meh liknos. So you have a mitzvah to lend it to him because he may not have the financial wherewithal to be able to buy it. He says, and this applies not just to the poor. If your neighbor, right, who's a middle class guy, perfectly falls into the category of an ashir, of a person of means, so then there's still a mitzvah to lend him. That's why the mitzvah of loaning is more encompassing than the mitzvah of tzedakah. Tzedakah only applies to poor people. The mitzvah of loans applies to wealthy people as well. And the same thing is lending someone different objects you have. V'zehu gemilus chasadim shakadosh baruch hu chafetz bo. And this is the type of gemach, of acts of chesed that Hashem desires. Who's he quoting here? Probably Abbas Chesed. Yeah, he's quoting the Abbas Chesed. Hakafas hachanut eno bichlal halva'a ve'eno mechuyev bazeh. It's an interesting thing, and he's quoting here the Abbas Chesed as well. Extending credit when you have a store is not included in this mitzvah, and you're not obligated to extend credit to people when you're running a business. And he says, he's quoting the Chafetz Chaim here in Avas Chesed. I guess, in other words, because you're running a business, you're entitled to say, look, I can't jeopardize my business by extending credit. It may end up, I may end up drowning in extended credit. So, sure. I'm sure he extended credit. The point is that it's not included. That's one point is right. You're not mechuyev to extend credit if you run a store. It's not included in this mitzvah because you can say, listen, I have to run a business responsibly, and sometimes it's actually better to divide your business from, I know some people who give away merchandise and they include that in their chesed, right? But there are other people who take the attitude that, you know what, I'd rather give cash for tzedakah, and I'm not going to involve these things in my business because, and there's a svara behind that, because sometimes it can become so overwhelming that you end up jeopardizing your bottom line in your business, and you have to be responsible. You have customers, you have employees, you have overhead, and all those other things. And so sometimes I guess that's the rationale. And he writes in the footnote, he says that doesn't exempt you. If, let's say, a poor person comes into your store and is hungry, you still have a mitzvah to give them something from your store if it's a small amount. But to extend large amounts of credit to a customer, does not fall under the rubric of this mitzvah. They have layaway.
They're ordering that small down payment. So the way they're seeking credit, they got to hope that you come and pick up.
Oh yeah, there are a lot of stores that work on layaway. The whole country of Israel works on layaway plans. On paying it off. Yeah, they pay. That's I don't know what you call it here, but in the U.S. we call it a layaway plan.
But that's after the purchase, right?
Yeah. Where they're slowly paying it off.
Find your item, if you have a item, you're giving a small down payment.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're going and ordering that item for you.
Sure.
And so it's a form of credit. They're hoping that you're going to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but the other side is that it's don't they sell that couch for a lot less because you deposit. You don't come back. That's part of the business. If you order $1,000 couch, you put down $250, and you don't show up. Well, now they can go sell that for $750. Like, or sell it for $1,000 again. That's business. That's why you do a deposit. You don't show up, you lose the deposit.
They're not doing it out of any sort of charitable.
No.
Yeah, it's a business
It's quite a business model.
Yeah. Okay. La'aniya Yisrael. V'shir ha'halva b'chein zman halva toloi kifi hasagas yada. He says the amount that you're mechuyev to lend and the limit, that the terms of how long you extend for a person to pay back the loan, there is no fixed amount. It all depends on your means, right? Don't bankrupt yourself. Don't drain your entire savings account to fulfill this mitzvah. Right? In other words, you have to be responsible with your assets. And also don't give a person an indefinite amount of time to pay back the loan. And even if you lent a person money 100 times in the past, there's still a mitzvah to continue loaning him money. In other words, the mitzvah doesn't have like, you can't say, well, I was Yotze with you already lending you money. I don't have to lend you money anymore. It's a recurring mitzvah. Your attitude should not be, oh, this guy is such a dray cup, constantly hocking me for more money to loan. But instead, you should view it like a person who's constantly getting a knock on the door from a customer who's coming to buy his merchandise. In other words, would you get annoyed at a person who's a loyal customer and is constantly buying your merchandise? In the same way, this guy keeps coming to you, giving you one more mitzvah, another mitzvah. Wow, I get to do so many mitzvahs with this one yid, right? So what a beautiful thing. That should be your attitude. Okay, so we'll hold it here for today.